श्रावक के अणुव्रत समझे, जीवन को हम धन्य करें। श्रावक के अणुव्रत समझे, जीवन को हम धन्य करें। पाप तजे व्रत अपना कर, पाप तजे व्रत अपना करे। सद्गुण और पुण्य भरे, हाँ भरे। श्रावक के अणुव्रत समझे, जीवन को हम धन्य करें। श्रावक की माता जीवों की जयना है, स्थावर जीवों पर हमें करनी करुणा है। जस जीवों की हिंसा से विरमना है, आत्म समान ही सब जीवों को समझना है। आओ करें, आओ करें, आओ करें रक्षा सभी की। आओ करें रक्षा सभी की। किसी के ना प्राण हरे ना हरे, सभी को अभय ही करे। सभी को अभय ही करे।
Good evening and welcome everybody to our 112th session of Jain Talks. Today we're very excited to have two very distinguished guests, Professor Arvind Panagrya as well as Arihant Panagrya, to talk about Dr. Ashok Panagriya's book, the late Dr. Ashok Panagrya. He was a Padma Shri awardee, a very, very distinguished neurologist, the winner of the B.C. Roy Award for Medical Excellence, and also the former Vice Chancellor of the Rajasthan University of Health Sciences. We were very fortunate to have him join us on Jain Talks for a lecture on October 16th, 2020, where he spoke about life, longevity, and happiness, God, the creator, and brain, the modulator. And in fact, he's expanded a lot about what he spoke about during that session in a new book that he's authored, which is called Monk in a Merc, which describes basically the tension between mental peace and material goals. It's available on Amazon and is extremely highly rated. And yeah, today we have the privilege and benefit of hearing from his brother, Professor Arvind Panagrya, as well as his son, Arihant Panagrya, who will speak both about his life and the lessons that the late Dr. Ashok Panagrya had for all of us today. And so, yeah, I'm just going to give a brief introduction about both of our distinguished speakers today. Arihant Panagrya is an equity analyst who's based out of London. He's a graduate of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, also my alma mater. And we obviously have Professor Arvind Panagrya, who's the winner of the Padma Bhushan. He's the former and first vice chairman of the Niti Aayog. He's a professor of economics at Columbia University and has previously been the chief economist at the Asian Development Bank. And I also have had the privilege of being one of his students and having that benefit. And yeah, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ashok Panagriya's son, Arihant, to tell us a little bit more about the book.
Well, thanks, Akshay. Thanks, thanks to Jain Foundation for doing this. Coincidentally, as you mentioned, my father was a guest with on one of the sessions at Jain Foundation, and it was the last interview that he did actually. So, and so I'm obviously delighted to be here. Before I talk about the book, I just want to talk about a few words about my father and the kind of influence he had on me. As you mentioned, he was one of top neurologists in India, and but to me, he was my closest friend, my sort of inspiration, my guru. I was fortunate, to be his son, and I had the luxury of talking to him whenever I wanted to. 5 minutes of chat with him would just, would brighten up my day and set me up for a couple of days at least. But any conversation actually that you would do with him, you would always sort of take away something new, something so deep, something so wise that you just wanted him to keep talking. And he was so well read despite the busy schedule that he had. He'd work for about 14, 15 hours a day. But he was always updated about things even beyond his own field. He would know about politics, about businesses, about the economy. He would take out the time for his family and friends as well. So, I sort of envied his time management skills as well, and something that I wish I can get better at. Most of all, I think if I have had to really pick the three things that I would take away from his life and sort of keep them as lessons, I would talk about generosity, integrity, and autonomy. My father was an extremely generous man. He would go out of his way to help people. He would forget his own problems and be more worried about any problems that his friend or his family member would be facing. Second, I think, is integrity. It was unquestionable. He would always say one thing, which is that do no harm and always give the most honest and the sincere advice that you could give to others. Third, I think, which had the biggest impact on me personally was his autonomy. I think he was never, as an individual, he was never really in love with money, and what he really valued was his ability to control the time and his sort of daily schedule. And I think this is it's written in the book about this difference between being wealthy and being rich, and in that sense, I felt he was the wealthiest man, and it really allowed him to define his life and live by those ideals. So this is how I'd like to remember him by, and of course, not a day goes by when I don't miss talking to him. But fortunately, as you said, he was able to finish the book before he left us. And reading this book feels like having a conversation with him. And I might be sort of biased here, but the book never disappoints. The book itself is about his own life. His journey and his experiences and the fascinating sort of medical cases he witnessed over his long sort of professional career. And the varied human interaction he had. And for my father, he lived a remarkable life, for anyone who knew him. Was aware of the humble beginnings. He had an extremely difficult childhood with very, very few resources, and my uncle could probably throw light on it. But to have ended up seeing about 5 million patients in his lifetime, it was just nothing short of genius. And genius he was. He would. There are numerous stories about patients visiting him, and he would just when they're walking inside this consulting room, he would notice them and start prescribing the medicines. It would take about 1 or 2 minutes. It was remarkable and probably a God gift in that sense. But really, I mean, it was his hard work and just this, limitless love that he had for his subject, that he went on to become so successful. Um, but despite that, I think what made my father's life really unique and what makes this book so different is his sort of emphasis on the possibility of attaining uh, both success and happiness. I mean, I think you and I both have read dozens of books, who force us to make a choice between them, between being happy and being successful. My father, was successful, but he was an incredibly happy man. I mean, and for him, he did it through his work, which he loved more than anything else. He wanted to be the best doctor he could become, so he could better serve his patients. And the more patients he saw, the better he became as a doctor. Uh, and it was through his patients, actually, that he got this idea of writing the book, because of his experiences with them. And in a way, I feel, this was meant to be. He was meant to write this book, and his patients sort of became the medium through which he realized that. But so, I mean, he was lucky to have had those interactions. He was lucky to have found something that he really liked at such a young age. And so that also made him realize the significance of luck that plays out in life. And he's written about these really interesting sort of exchanges that he's had with numerous astrologers and people from occult sciences, and how that had an effect on him and his sort of life's philosophy. So all of this, I think, and these interesting sort of nuggets that he's put in the book, somehow you just end up carrying with you once you finish reading it. Personally, for me, I sort of, I read the book when he passed away, and it came around the same time. The book was published on the same time he passed away. So reading about his life and in his own words was of course surreal at that point. But for us, it really helped us a lot, to deal with his death, with his passing away. Because as a doctor, he'd seen life and death from such close quarters. For us to read about that and just accepting that, there are certain things that are just beyond your control, really helped us to deal with it. But beyond just the family, I really think the book will help many others, who would relate to it, and who would feel that they can take something very, very important and interesting from it. Because the book's core message itself, and we can obviously, we'll discuss it even more as we go along. But the message itself is simple, and I hope it, it spreads far and wide. And the message, of course, is that, you can follow a certain path, you can train yourself, you can train your mind, and actually seek happiness and find success. And once you've found success, you should be able to share that and ultimately attain moksha. The book is about attaining moksha. The definition of moksha itself in the book is very different from the traditional or the definition of moksha, which is liberation from society or work. But for my father, moksha was about work and etching out your place in the society and just engaging with it. And of course, sharing those spoils along the way. I mean, I don't know how much time I have, but I'd sort of, I'd wrap it up by saying that anyone who will pick up the book, be that any age or whatever you're doing in your life, there's a lot to pick from the lessons he learned and the philosophy sort of written about in his life. But there's a lot to learn from his life as well, which is what the book is ultimately about. His life story is, as I mentioned, he lived a remarkable life. But his life story itself is a story of possibility, going from where he started and where he ultimately reached. So I feel that would inspire a ton of people, and people who are starting out or taking a shot at life again or going through a difficult phase. It'll help them believe that they can, make a difference. They can live a happy life. They can live a successful life. And in the book, of course, there's a clear sort of method which is, written about through which you can do that. So Akshay, back to you, and thanks for giving me the time and a platform to talk about the book and my father.
No, of course, it's our pleasure. And I think it's really a message that's deserving of a wider audience. And so I think the pleasure is all ours to have you. And I know you mentioned that you might be biased, but you actually aren't biased, because the book is rated 4.5 stars plus on Amazon, which is an objective rating, right? So it actually is a great book, and we have the pleasure of knowing that. Professor, should I hand it over to you, and then we can do the Q&As together? Or
Perfect.
Perfect.
Perfect, Akshay. So first of all, thank you. Thanks to Mr. Shah. Thanks to Neil. Really pleasure to be back. I spoke on my own biography last time I was at this forum, which was a biography of my father. I'll give some loose connection to that later. But first of all, my great pleasure to be back here. Since this is the time of asking Kshama of everybody, so Kshama request to all. So for the mistakes made, but also mistakes that I'm probably going to make now as I speak. So let me first just describe briefly the book. It's a wide-ranging book. The message, its core message itself is simple, and I'll come to that. But the breadth of the book is quite breathtaking. Partly it's autobiographical. So there are some fascinating anecdotes in it. It starts out actually with a set of anecdotes relating to, soon after he got his degree, DM degree in neurology. So he was actually, so my brother was the first properly trained neurologist in the state of Rajasthan. So, now we have come a long way, but it's quite remarkable. He, around 1982, he finished. In 1983, so he returned actually. So for 2 years, he spent in Chandigarh, which is where the PGI Institute, the PGI Institute in Chandigarh was the only one that gave DM in neurology in those days. AIMS in Delhi didn't do so. So, soon after he came, he was the first qualified serious neurologist. And there was he describes the series of these cases where, the leading doctor of the state, who was, more or less the godlike status, which is what my brother then went on to have as well in due course. So this very senior, most revered doctor in 3 of these cases kind of declared the patient more or less beyond recovery. But they somehow the families in these cases knew that this young doctor has just come in and he specializes particularly in this particular area of brain and all. And he comes in and actually miraculously, he would never say that I cured them. So he would always say that I treated them, God cured them. But these are fascinating cases, where there was no hope at all, and they had been largely declared as now beyond recovery by the doctor who was most trusted actually in this state. So that really actually also in a way established him those cases, because those days Jaipur was a small place, the word got around very quickly and all, and so he very quickly became very famous, and of course very justifiably so. So there are several of these anecdotes of his life. They also relate to astrology, because some of the predictions that got made about his own life, he talks about those and all. So we can come to that, maybe some of it in the Q&A and all. The core theme of the book is the title of the book, Monk in a Mercedes. Well, it's abbreviated Monk in a Merc, but it's about referring to the Mercedes. And then the title speaks for the core theme, but I'll come to that. I think that's what I want to spend most of my time on. The book is also a primer on how the brain works. So what is its structure, what parts of it govern what actions, and how malfunctions in specific parts of the brain give rise to specific unusual disorders. And so in each of these cases, he gives, because, as Arihant said, he saw millions of cases through his life. And I remember, and whenever I visited back, home, you could see there 300, 400, 500 patients lined up. It's still mind-boggling to me how he handled those. And at the end of the day, he would come and say, yeah, I saw everybody, and nobody has to come back. It's quite remarkable. His management in this sense, what Arihant was saying may seem exaggeration, but it is not. In 1 minute, he would do the patient. So he saw, and therefore, there are some incredibly unusual patients that he describes, and how those particular ailments related to what specific part of the brain and how, etc. So it's also a very nice primer on that. He then also gives a simple workout on the brain, and the motivation there is that, look, we used to exercising our body. We do a lot of good to our body, but we never think of doing the same to our brain. But the brain actually is the most important organ of the body. And the way he puts it is that, look, all the other organs of the body are elsewhere in your body, but brain actually sits up here. It's the king of all organs. And yet we don't do enough for it. So he has a whole long chapter in the book which gives out the full workout, very much in the same, the way you have the exercise regimen, you also need an exercise regimen for the brain. And that is an important chapter in the book also, to my mind. And then he talks about how luck is important. He was very aware of, obviously, that a lot of the things we cannot explain that happen in our lives, both good and bad, and that's what luck is all about. And he went well beyond, actually, the medical science. So medical science, of course, was his core, and any issue on which the medical science gave him the answers, that's where the answers would come from for him. But where he went into any dead end as far as the medical science was concerned, then he would explore. He was quite open to looking at alternative solutions, which could be in homeopathy, which could be in Ayurveda, but which could also be in astrology. So he also gives good examples of that, how he complemented even astrology to advise the patients. Astrology can't give you about how to cure something, but it can give you some idea of when certain ailment might strike you, and so you could, even though there is no cure for that ailment, how best you could prepare to deal with it when it will strike you. So that's the rough kind of summary of the book. Now, core theme is that the monk in a Merc is about the fact that there is no conflict between having a life that is driven by our ambition to be successfully socially and career-wise, and enjoying the comforts of life on the one hand, and achieving genuine happiness on the other. And often, in our philosophies, religion, etc., we tend to see a bit of conflict between the two. But his point, really, the core message of the book is that there need not be any conflict between those two. Now, since my brother sets the context for this theme very nicely at the very beginning in the preface, I'll read out some parts of the preface very quickly. So he says that, I have practiced neurology for over 40 years and have seen the miracles of life and the burden of death from very close quarters. During this time, I have served I have served millions of patients. These include a garden variety of the rich and not so rich. One of the themes that has remained constant in this journey is this search for the ways to find liberation from things that trouble us every day and attain the elusive yet ultimate goal of happiness. So this, being monk is basically interpreting as being happy, and being in Mercedes is basically saying that there is no conflict between being happy and living a good life. So the book is an attempt to lay down a path for achieving genuine happiness. What makes the book different from other books with similar themes is that it is written by a neurologist. Therefore, brain is at the center of most of what my brother writes in the book. He accepts the role of luck, but offers suggestions on how we can train our brain to overcome the hurdles that luck places on the path to achieving genuine happiness. And once again, let me quote from his preface. He says, "My fascination with the making of a good life began when I became a student of neurology. I was curious about the inner workings of the brain and the potential for tapping into its resourcefulness for health, longevity, and happiness. This curiosity turned into a lifelong passion to master the practice of mindful living. That involved ways and methods to use the brain's strengths, overcome the weakness, and harness its underlying power. All this while accepting genetic constraints and circumstances of birth, which I allude to as the role of luck and chance in our lives. The old adage rings true here: great men are made, not born. God may well be the creator, but the brain is definitely the modulator." That was the theme of the lecture that he spoke on at Jain Talks in October 2020. Well, so how do we attain genuine happiness, right? So that's the theme. Here he says that our traditional culture places excessive emphasis on renunciation. So, a good point he makes is that, look, that is certainly one path. But if everybody were to actually take the path of renunciation, then there will be nothing to renunciate, right? The world and the society as it exists would cease to exist. Everybody would be back. And so, you'll back to kind of the nomadic days, right? That everybody has renunciated. There's no society left, and therefore no renunciation left to be done. Nevertheless, this idea of renunciation has remained even in the modern culture. This dominates still. That's the only path to happiness. And you may have read about 2 decades ago, there was this book called The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. Right, so this is about a lawyer who, a successful lawyer in America, who becomes very successful at a very young age, but then has a heart attack, comes to India to visit, and goes to Himalayas to various gurus and all who advise him and all. And so he then kind of goes back to a life of obscurity and restraint. Very much again, it is in the spirit of renunciation, not necessarily in the old sense of renunciation, but the modern way of renunciation. But my brother basically argues that such renunciation is not the only path to happiness. Indeed, if all of us were to end up adopting, so the main message of the book is that genuine happiness comes from sharing what you have with your fellow beings. So he emphasizes very much the sharing part. And that's, I think, because of his own life. He went that path early on, which I'll mention in a second. But here, the important thing is that he talks about these emotions, right? That ultimately happiness is one of the emotions. And he talks about, the fact that for that, sharing, whether it's your knowledge, or it is your wealth, is central to achieving happiness. I suspect that at some level, this idea should be very familiar to all of you, from the Jain, those of us from Jain community, because Jain tradition in a different way already has that. Jain community is one of the few, I would say, actually around the world, that does not frown upon wealth accumulation by Shravaks. And to my mind, really, this is principally because it encourages the wealthy in the community to spread their wealth widely among the needy. And Jainism, in fact, prescribes 4 forms of dhan, right? Dhan, which is for the Shravaks. And it says this is Ahar, which is food, Aushadhi, which is medicine, Gyan, which is knowledge, and protection to the weak. So these are very well prescribed actually to Shravats. And this is roughly what my brother is talking about as well. So there is certainly a good convergence here. Only difference I would draw really here is that whereas, religion teaches us as something that we do it for our afterlife, and sort of, that is something that you are doing it for the good of everybody. My brother argues here that, look, this is something you do for yourself, that it is ultimately the paths to happiness for yourself. And once you begin to share, you see how happy it makes you. And it's also happiness that actually sustains, happiness that lasts once you've trained your mind. So for my brother, the sharing of knowledge really, especially sharing of knowledge, came very early in his life through medical camps where he would freely treat epilepsy patients. And this he started, very early on 1983 or so after he arrived from his DM degree in Chandigarh. Later, when he began accumulating modest amounts of wealth, he also came to share that as well. And often he, if he would go to visit an institution, often he would announce, given his capacity to donate, he would always announce some sort of donation to the institution. He established also a foundation that he would use to cover the expenses of medicine and diagnostic tests for the patients who could not afford them. So he was a firm believer in the cross-subsidization of the treatment of the poor from the fees that he would collect from those who could actually afford them. So now last point very quickly, I probably a little bit over my time. Let me take 2 or 3 minutes. The last point is about what you're going to ask, so where is brain in all this? I mean, this is something that we know. And this is where the neurologist comes into play. This is modulating and training of the brain itself. And he says that, look, moments of happiness come in, but they are harder to sustain. And they're harder to sustain because, of the 6 universal emotions, happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, and surprise. These are, this is the original emotions that Paul Ekman, who was a famous psychologist from the United States, had identified. He says, out of these 6, only happiness is the only completely clean, clear, positive emotion. The rest are either negative emotions, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, surprise. Either they are outright negative emotions or they are partially negative. But happiness is the only positive one. So it's only one of these. And it also turns out that our mind originally is hardwired to kind of, stick to the negative emotions. So he uses this terminology of Velcro and Teflon. That when it comes to negative emotions, we are Velcro. Our brain is Velcro. The negative emotions stick to it. We also have the tendency to relive these over and over again. Whereas happiness is an emotion which is like Teflon, it doesn't stick. And this is where you need to train your mind. And so this is where he then comes in and talks about how a brain is in fact very much malleable. You can train it in ways that would not only lead to greater happiness, but also sustain it. And so he talks a good bit about a lot of the advice or the recommendations from a neurological point of view that he offers have to do with how you get out of this pathological cycle of kind of reliving the negative emotions and focusing on the positive emotions. So that I think is the neurological side of the story. And let me just conclude by saying that the book otherwise is wide-ranging. A lot of examples he uses, and these come from science, from fiction, from science fiction, from astrology, from Indian mythology, from Hollywood, from Bollywood. So it's a wide reach. I think he read widely about various things and has sort of tried to build it into the narrative of the book. So let me stop there. Sorry, I took 5 minutes longer than I should have, but I hope that gives you some flavor of the book.
No, thank you so much, Professor. I think that was a great summary and also a lot of food for thought for our attendees. And also, I think a great encouragement to actually buy the book and read it in its entirety, especially with all the anecdotes that you mentioned. So I'm just going to do a few questions for both our panelists, and then we're going to open it up to the audience to ask the questions that they have. If you could just post your questions in the Q&A chat box, I'll read out the question itself as well as the person who asked the questions. But yeah, let me get started. So, Arihant, can you tell us a little bit about how your father actually came up with the idea of this book? What inspired him? You're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, yeah. Akshay, before I do that, I actually, saw this advertisement of this chocolate company, Dairy Milk, today morning. And the lines that go in the advertisement were, कुछ खास है सभी में, कुछ बात है सभी में, क्या स्वाद है जिंदगी के. So I think that completely personified my father, where, he was an optimist, and he would sort of, celebrate the tiniest of our achievements and ignore the most serious, failures that we saw. And why I say it personifies him is because, he really valued this gift of life. It was, as I said, he was an incredibly happy man. But, he really valued that, he's human and he's got this chance at life. And as a doctor, when he sort of saw about 5 million patients, 200, 300 patients every day, and people would come to him, he saw patients from top of, people who were successful, people who were not successful. But a common sort of link that he found was that they were not happy in their lives. There's something that they complained about was missing. I think one of the patients that he's mentioned, and it's anonymous, of course, is that there was this banker from Hong Kong who visited him, very successful, went to top colleges, I think he was working at a bank. And he came visiting him for one of his health issues. And I told my father, he's not happy in his life. What else should he do to be happy? He's followed what he was supposed to do. So patients like that, which is what I said in my initial remarks, is that, these ideas and, came through his patients and the people he met, because of his work, because he was a doctor, because he was so sort of ingrained in the society, he also met a lot of religious leaders, and felt that there is a concept that he could frame in how to live life and how to be successful as well. You don't have to choose between the two. And ultimately, I feel like he was a teacher at heart. He loved sharing. In fact, he had this chai with Dr. Panagariya, where he would actually counsel students and guide them and tell them, this is what you should do with your life. So he loved doing that. And he realized that, he's a neurologist, one of India's best neurologists, and he has the knowledge, he has the wisdom to actually share those ideas in a book. And fortunately, I think, he was able to finish it. So he had been planning to write one, to be honest, for a very long time. I think about 10 years he's been thinking of writing a book. Fortunately, as I said, he was able to finish it. So it turned out to be about his life, about his philosophy. And yeah, it's a fascinating read.
No, for sure. I think inspires a lot of us to do more writing as well. I think
Yes.
one of the attendees, in fact, is like, how is he getting so much time to read various books, to be such a successful professional, as well as to write a book? I think it's quite remarkable. And I think you mentioned that, right? I think he was a very great manager of time. So yeah, I'm going to ask one to Professor Panagrya now. Professor Panagrya, Dr. Ashok Panagrya talks about the interplay between luck and chance, as well as between karma. And I think it was like an interesting question for us, right? Between like determinism as well as like what role and agency we can have in our own lives. So would love to hear your thoughts as well as Dr. Ashok Panagriya's thoughts on that tension that exists.
Good, very good question, Akshay. Maybe let me take a crack at it, from the perspective of the horoscope itself. So here's a chapter there actually on luck. It comes much later in the book, where he also recounts this fantastic story. It really, even though I'd known of it, most of the stories, to me, my brother was the best friend in my life. Somehow, we perhaps because we were children of the same father and mother, so we had probably very similar values as well. But more so also because, I think he was only 2 years older than me, and so we grew up together. And so we shared almost everything, so most of his anecdotes I was aware of, but just reading it back in the context was interesting. So, when he was soon after, I think this was even before he went to Chandigarh. So this was really like, late 70s. Somebody predicted 2 or 3 big things in his life. He said, you're going around in bicycle right now, but you are going to be actually be going around in very big cars, and you'll be changing your car every 3rd, 4th year. And at that time he says, it's completely out of this world. And it so happens that the very next day of this prediction being made, somebody steals his bicycle, so the man is back on his feet. So he's walking to college. So he says, how could this is impossible? But it did happen, and also, so there were a couple of other similar predictions made. But then he talks that ultimately, to him, because he knew reading horoscopes. So one of our pastimes, actually, always when we visited back home, was to sit with him for hours and discuss, our horoscope and children's horoscope and everybody else's. This is a good pastime. And later on, Arihant also became good at it, so he would join in on his side as well. But so he says, look, in the horoscope, my favorite kind of houses, it's divided into these 12 houses. And he says my favorite houses are 9, 10, 11, and 12. 12, of course, is the death, so over which you have no control. That's an exit house. But 9 is bhagya. So that's your luck. But 10 is karma. And 11 is phal. So he says that fine, so 9 determines, what kind of bhagya and this is maybe Arihant can talk about the swimming pool theory and so forth, but is it what you are endowed with, whether you are born in rich family, poor family, or what kind of conditions, in which country, in which state, wherever, you have no control over it. That's something that you're given. I mean, so he also, by the earlier talks about these two doors, that there is the birth door and there is an exit door, death door, over which you have no control, absolutely nothing you can do, but it's everything in between about which you can do something, and that's where karma becomes important. And so he says, look, 9th is followed by 10th, which is karma. So whatever the 9th might give you, but unless you do what is in the 10th, whatever endowment was given could be lost or gained, depending on what you do in the 10th house karma. And then the phal, the outcome is 11th house. So there's a sequence to that. And so karma becomes obviously the most critical link between the bhagya and phal. So that's his view, that look, in the end, karma, even in astrology, in the end, karma becomes extremely important. And of course, traditionally 10th house is what is regarded as probably the most important house by most astrologers. So That's how I would answer your question.
No, makes
Actually,
sense. I think.
I just like to add one thing to that.
Yeah.
So because we're talking about luck and destiny, in the book, he's mentioned this exchange that took place in Mahabharata, and he's picked up a lot from Indic philosophy in the book. But it just struck me about this instance that in the Mahabharata, the fable goes that Kunti and Subhadra. So Subhadra was, I think, the wife of Arjun, and Kunti was the mother of the Pandavas. I think I'm not very good at it.
That's correct.
So Kunti asks Subhadra, what do you? And she was pregnant, and Kunti asks, what do you wish your son to become? Like, do you have any wish? Subhadra replies saying, I want my child to be Shurveer. Shurveer is one with, special skills, special qualities, and well-built, etc. And so Kunti replies saying that, do you not think my children are Shurveer? And look at what happened to them. They've spent their lives in exile and fighting a battle that, has taken their life. So would you want your child to go through the same? So Subhadra replies, I don't know. Like, what do you expect me to answer to that question? So Kunti says, you should demand that your son be Bhagyavan. That demand that your son is lucky. So, which is, he's tried to make the argument that, luck plays such an important part in our lives, and yet we don't give it as much importance as we should. And the sort of instances, of course, my uncle spoke about it, which is what pushed him into studying astrology. So yeah, just sort of, I found this story fascinating, and I couldn't stop myself from.
No, I think it's very true and very apt, for sure. And I think definitely a lot of life lessons for us. And actually, Professor Panagrya was telling about this very interesting analogy that he had about the swimming pool theory. If you can just tell us a little bit more about it, because I think it's very well put.
I think, as I was saying, he's written about luck, and because he saw so many patients, and there were patients that he saw who were sort of terminally ill, but somehow they survived and lived for long. And there were patients he saw that who had robust sort of diagnosis but couldn't make it, and which is what made him interested, ultimately, because he wanted to know what is it that is beyond the science of medicine, like my uncle said, in this, God is basically someone who cures, and the doctors can only treat. So he knew sort of the significance of luck, and which is what he's written about in the book. But alongside the interest in astrology, he also used to tell us and warn us that, you should not depend on your kundli or your birth chart and on just luck, because what he used to also say is that karam to karna padega, you'll have to work hard. So this swimming pool theory that he had, and he's written in the book, is that, what he believed in was that each of us is, blessed with this pool, this swimming pool. This pool is basically made up of our genes, of our parents, of the environment that we grow up in. That is our bhagya, that is our destiny. You can't change that. What you can work on is how good of a swimmer you can become in that pool. Whether you can, swim for long hours, whether you can go to the deepest side of the pool, or how good you become and how good you use those resources. That's your karma. It doesn't really matter how someone else is leading their lives. Someone else, might have a better sort of swimming pool or blessed with much more than what you have. But that doesn't really affect your life. What affects your life is what you're blessed with and how good of it you're able to use. So he used to say karma and bhagya are joined at like a hip together at the hip, which is again one of the more sort of interesting things I read in the book, that it's not just karma, it's not just bhagya, but a combination of the two, that how you live your life. So essentially, that's the theory of karma and bhagya.
No, for sure. Thank you so much for that. I think it's a very powerful analogy, and I think it really summarizes even the kind of tension that Professor Panagrya was talking about. So yeah, there's one more question from the audience, by the way. Request more people to ask questions. I think it's an incredible opportunity to have the panelists we have and to ask questions. One of the questions again from the audience is like, isn't there like a slippery slope? So if you are earning money or if you are trying to improve your material well-being, you kind of get caught in that cycle and you just want to earn more money and publish more and be the best professional. And how would love to hear both your thoughts on that. How do you prevent the slippery slope?
No, but this is where the whole idea of training your brain into something comes in. So there's a very good question, actually, I must say. It is certainly a slippery slope. And what you need to do is train your brain so that it sends the right messages to your feet, not to slip. And this is where early on, some sort of activist thinking on that I need to share. That in the end, it will make me happier if I'm sharing my successes with others. And sharing successes is not just to get the encomiums and kudos from your friends and admirers. That's not what he means by sharing. By sharing, he means giving back what you have earned, whether it is in terms of knowledge, in terms of skills, or in terms of wealth. Spread it out. I think and I personally again want to go back to the analogy from Jainism, that the idea, at least in Jainism, about accumulating wealth is to ultimately spread it across the community. And it's not an accident, that Jain community, however small it is the one with the least amount of poverty. The NSS data, the National Sample Survey data, show it, by far very low rates of poverty among Jains compared with even Sikhs. Sikh is another community which is very much, it believes in this kind of sharing, and they are the next one, but Jains, the poverty rates among Jains is even lower than among the Sikhs. So that tradition, and because the wealth creation was not frowned upon in Jain community, you see that Jains are among the most entrepreneurial communities. So, but this is where also I think my other idea, Akshay, that I just talked about a little bit in my kind of biography of my father in the last chapter. I talked about these resume values and the eulogy values. You might remember that the values that don't help you go far in life necessarily, meaning in terms of ambition, career, and wealth accumulation and so forth, but that are values which people always remember once you are gone. The eulogy values, so your integrity, but those are in a way, if one were to broaden my brother's kind of idea, one would say that you need to train the mind to also cultivate the eulogy values. The resume values come naturally to us because they appeal to our baser kind of instincts, so to say. But mind is to be trained, to also internalize early on. And this is why I think to some degree, when I talked about eulogy values, these are the values that you learn in the family. So your parents, when you're early on when you're a child, it's a little easier to hardwire your brain early in life. And so learning these in the family becomes a little easier, but then the family has to do it. The parents have to really consciously do it, and parents themselves have to, by action, show that these are important values, so that the children then imbibe them automatically. So this is where I think this imbibing of these eulogy values, or so to say, the sharing of your wealth and your knowledge, has to start a little bit early on. And in my brother's case, I think this did happen in a very natural sort of way, because that's how my father was. He always encouraged this. He started off very early, soon after he came after his DM, these camps he started in, at least once a month, he would drive out 100 kilometers out into another town. And for a whole kind of, starting at 8 in the morning all the way till 9 or 10 at night, he would see the patients one after the other continuously. And that sort of, at the time he didn't have his own riches to share any wealth, but he could share his knowledge. And subsequently, as he got more wealth, he was able to share the wealth as well.
No, for sure. I think the sharing part, I think, is the important one.
Yeah. And to see that, look, this is for my own good, this makes me happy, right? And once you train it, rather than that, I'm doing it for my afterlife. In this sense, I think when one does it more as a concept of dhan, it's sort of more like, as if I'm doing somebody a favor or something, or that I'm doing it for my afterlife. But it really is for your own happiness in the current life. I think that's how it has to be viewed. But it has to be hardwired. I mean, so otherwise the slippery slope will most definitely seize control. And this is exactly that, the monk who sold us a Ferrari. It's exactly that story that, then he gets a heart attack and then comes, and so he goes to the other extreme of renunciation.
True. So swinging pendulum. No, for sure. So we have a Smita who kind of has a couple of questions. So her first one is that usually a man of science doesn't accept astrology, right? Professor, in your talk, you also mentioned, like, when the domain is science, he answers from science, and beyond, I think he's more open. But how do you, what made him like accepting of different disciplines, right? Because the bar for evidence is very different in science. And I think astrology is more open. And so how did he accept both of those disciplines? And then she also asked that last time he was on the platform, he was working on horoscopes and genoscopes and trying to understand the link between the two. And this covered 100-odd people. Has this research been furthered? And Smita would love to, and obviously the wider audience would also love to understand the results.
Okay, very quickly, then Arihant can give his, I'll give mine very quickly on each of those. So first on going from science to other things, right? So being an Indian sort of helps there for sure. I think we in India are trained to be much more accepting of other things, things that go beyond and things that we don't understand. In his case, perhaps it also happened very early in his life, all these predictions that people did in his life, and then he began to see them coming true. That may have. But he was also very devoted to his patients, and so he was always looking for what else can I do. So he describes one case there, that there's one particular, I think it was some sort of epileptic attack that would happen in this patient, and there was nothing, cure that at least at the time existed. So he then looked into his horoscope and he tried to connect the, as to when it happens, and he was able to sort of see that there was a certain configuration of planets around which this happened. So he said, well, then if this has happened enough number of times in his life already, in this particular patient's life, then very likely that this is how it will happen in the future. So you can at least, there's nothing we can do about it, but we can prepare to deal with it a bit better. So that's how for his patients, he was seeking answers, that, okay, so my science is, so as long as he had answer in science, he would never go for anything other than science. But there were also other patients where he said, my neurology gives me this answer, but the astrology is going the other way. And there is one case he describes where astrology went where actually the outcome was where the astrology was taking him, not where neurology was taking him. So So it's sort of, in his case, the more he did of it, I think they reinforced that there are, he calls these non-linear sciences, that the regular science, his neurology was a linear science, in the sense of this whole thing, that it doesn't proceed without adequate kind of evidence, the evidence has to be there. Whereas non-linear sciences go a little differently. On this other research he was doing, I think he was able to actually chalk out the patterns in 100 or so horoscopes very well of the families, from grandfather to the child, where he saw that these were being inherited. The horoscopes really followed very similar kinds of patterns. So there's some inheritance going on. And similarly genes, but on genes he couldn't get enough funding to get the two research to. I mean, ultimately he needed to bring the two pieces together, but there was not enough funding for the genes side of the story to complete the thing. So it remained incomplete. Arihant.
Yeah, I think to others it might seem like a contradiction, being a doctor and also being an astrologer, but it doesn't seem to me like that, because he had an open mind. He was very flexible, and he would constantly change his mind if he saw the evidence that there exists something that should be looked at. Medicine as a science, it's a linear science, right? It follows sort of a defined progression from line A to line B. Non-linear, on the other hand, which is astrology, it involves a lot of chaos, right? You can't predict the workings based on predefined models, but just because you can't do that, you shouldn't ignore that also. So, and in fact, he found a lot of similarities between medicine and astrology. In the book, of course, he's gone in detail, but medicine is a scientific stream, but it's also an art, and so is astrology. Any disease, any sort of disease that one might have, it could elicit different courses of treatment, based on the doctor you go to. But the science of medicine is based on accepted principles, and so is astrology. Astrology is based on accepted principles. Interpretation and implementation, will obviously depend on the astrologer himself. So astrology, in a way, is not very different. It follows the same dictum. Interpretation can sort of make or break your faith in astrology. Yeah, I mean, I would again say, if he didn't find any contradiction between the science of medicine and the science of astrology. I'm calling it science, even though it's not recognized as mainstream science. But he also said that just because mainstream, just because it's not recognized as science yet, doesn't mean that it will not be in the next whatever years or decades. And he was hopeful that it would change and people would accept it, and obviously and there's this interesting phrase that he used always. He said, in astrology, there are sort of three levels of your faith. One is Vishwas, Ati Vishwas, and Andhvishwas. So you can have faith in a doctor or in an astrologer, but if you have blind faith in either of the two, you're digging your own grave. So so yeah, I guess I'll end it like that. Yeah.
No, for sure. Thank you for that. I know we're running up on time, so I'm just going to take the liberty from the attendees to stretch by like a few more minutes and ask one or two more of the really great questions that we do have from the audience. I think one of the questions, this is from Mr. Chandramohan Gupta, is that when we're trying to share and when we're trying to help, oftentimes we try to help our family or like our inner circle, but perhaps not as easily as people who require genuine help. And so if we think about sharing as one of the things that really makes a monk and a monk, how do we, what are your thoughts on that?
My take is that, look, one, in every community, there are people who are needy. So I don't think, especially in our country right now, at our per capita income of about $2,100, this is still very, very low per capita income, and the needs of many actually are totally basic needs is what I'm talking about, are unfulfilled. So if the message can, I mean, I understand that it'll be good if we were also kind of sharing across all communities, across the entire globe and so forth. We could do that and all. It is simply that, the way our brain functions, we find it easier to share within our community, So personally, I don't frown upon that. If every community would actually have that tradition, then every community will be taken care of. So we'll achieve the same outcome. But again, at the personal level, of course, who stops you, right? At the personal level, if you think that there are even needier people who are beyond your own community, by all means, you can share beyond your community, right? And also, by the way, community doesn't necessarily mean, defined by our religion, caste or something. A community is also around us, and around us, of course, wherever we live, there are needy people, certainly at India's current level of development. So I don't think that is a constraining factor.
Oh, for sure. Awesome. And so I think with that, just wanted to share my thank you to both of our very distinguished panelists. And I'm sharing the link to the book on Amazon in the chat box, and we'll also share it with everybody. Highly recommend the book. It's extremely well rated. We heard so much about it. And I think it really does address a very important question. So just wanted to thank you again, Professor Panagrya, Arihant. Really appreciate your time and kind of explaining this amazing book to all of our attendees. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Akshay, for having us.
It's our pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much.